Julia Roberts. The smile that once made the entire world believe in fairy tales. But behind that layer of red lipstick, there was never a truly peaceful life. At 57, as the spotlight softens and the applause fades, Julia Roberts comes face to face with her quietest enemy of all, a loneliness that began in childhood, one that fame, no matter how dazzling, could never heal. Long before the red carpets, before the flashbulbs, before the smile that would one day circle the globe, there was a small town in the American South. Smyrna, Georgia. A place where the earth cracked under the heat, where humidity clung to the walls, and where isolation was not a feeling, but a condition of life. Wooden houses aged quickly under rain and neglect. Dreams did the same. Julia grew up in a family of artists, dreamers in a land that had little patience for dreaming. Her parents were actors, believers in imagination and expression, yet their household was fragile, stretched thin by money, pressure, and unspoken resentment. In a conservative region still divided by race, they made a brave and controversial choice. They opened an acting school that welcomed both black and white children together. It was an act of quiet rebellion, of moral courage. Outside, they were admired. Inside, the cracks widened. When Julia was still very young, her parents' marriage collapsed. The separation did not arrive with explanations, only with absence. Her father left. The house grew colder, not just in temperature, but in spirit. For a child, abandonment does not announce itself as tragedy. It enters silently, settles into the bones, and teaches lessons without words. Her mother remarried. What was meant to restore stability instead deepened the darkness. Arguments echoed through thin walls. Doors slammed. Nights were filled with tension that pressed against the chest. Neighbors would later whisper that the police had been called more than once. Inside that house, Julia learned an early rule of survival. Be quiet. Walk softly. Breathe carefully. Silence became armor. She developed a stutter. Words betrayed her, catching in her throat, trembling before they could escape. At school, she withdrew. She avoided eye contact. She sat at the edges of rooms, shrinking herself to avoid attention. Shame wrapped itself around her voice, convincing her that speaking was dangerous. At home, silence kept the peace. In public, it kept her invisible. There was no place that felt truly safe. Not the classroom. Not the kitchen. Not even her own bedroom. Safety became an abstract idea, something other children seemed to possess naturally. Julia learned instead how to observe, how to read moods, how to sense danger before it arrived. These were not childhood skills. They were survival instincts. Then came the loss that would define her inner world forever. Her father, the gentlest presence in her life, fell ill. Throat cancer. He did not speak of it. He did not want to frighten his daughter. Even his death arrived quietly, like everything else that mattered. When he was gone, Julia was left with something both precious and devastating. Cassette tapes. Before bedtime, he had recorded stories in his voice. Calm. Warm. Steady. At night, Julia would curl beneath her blanket, press play, and listen as his voice filled the darkness. The room would soften. The fear would retreat. Sound became comfort. Sound became memory. She replayed the tapes again and again, as if repetition could hold him in place, as if listening long enough could prevent loss from being final. Eventually, the tapes wore out. The voice cracked, stretched, and faded. But by then, something irreversible had already formed inside her. She had learned that love could disappear without warning. That gentleness was fragile. And that if she wanted to survive, she would have to build strength from within. This was where the light began. Not bright. Not visible. But persistent. In the shadows of a broken home, Julia Roberts learned how to feel deeply without showing it, how to endure without being seen, and how pain, when carried long enough, could one day be transformed into something powerful. Before the world ever fell in love with her smile, she had already mastered something far more difficult. She had learned how to live with wounds that never fully close. Leaving home was not an act of courage. It was an act of necessity. Julia did not escape Georgia with a grand plan or a clear destination. She left with a small suitcase, a few folded clothes, and a belief so fragile it could shatter at any moment. New York did not greet her with promise. It greeted her with winter. The city was loud, indifferent, and unforgiving. Her first room was barely a room at all. Cracked walls. A heater that did not work. At night, the cold crept in like a living thing. She slept wearing her coat, breath visible in the dark, pretending the shiver was temporary. Hunger became routine. Meals were measured. Instant noodles stretched across days, sometimes longer than they should have. During the day, she chased auditions. At night, she returned to silence. Casting rooms became rituals of rejection. She stood beneath harsh lights, delivered lines, smiled when told to wait, and left with polite nods that meant no. Again. And again. And again. More than 200 times, the same answer was handed back to her in different forms. Not right. Not now. Not you. Each rejection chipped away at something unseen. Yet she returned the next morning. Acting was no longer ambition. It was refuge. On stage, in front of a camera, she could turn pain into something legible. Sorrow became expression. Fear softened into vulnerability. The wounds of childhood finally had a language. She learned to translate suffering into emotion. To let her eyes speak when her voice once could not. In those moments, she was not the quiet girl from a broken home. She was present. Visible. Alive. Nights were the hardest. Alone in her room, wrapped in layers of clothing, she whispered the same promise into the dark. Try again. It was not motivation. It was prayer. A sentence repeated not because it sounded hopeful, but because stopping would mean disappearing. The city tested her limits. Snow piled on sidewalks as she walked home from failed auditions, shoulders hunched, fingers numb. Streetlights cast long shadows that followed her, silent witnesses to a dream refusing to die. There were moments when quitting felt reasonable. Sensible. Even merciful. But something deeper would not let go. Then, almost without warning, a crack appeared. A small commercial. Clear skin. A fleeting smile. Nothing glamorous. Nothing cinematic. Yet it changed everything. That brief appearance earned her a union card. A thin piece of paper, insignificant to the world, but monumental to her. It was proof that she existed inside the industry she had been knocking on for so long. No one watching that advertisement knew the cost behind that smile. The cold nights. The hunger. The humiliation of being overlooked again and again. But Julia knew. And she carried it with her, quietly. That moment did not end her struggle. It did not lift her out of poverty. But it did something far more important. It confirmed that endurance mattered. That persistence could bend reality, if only slightly. In that narrow New York room, with the city roaring outside and silence pressing in, Julia Roberts was no longer just running from her past. She was running toward a future she could barely see, guided only by instinct, resilience, and a belief whispered night after night. Try again. And somehow, against all logic, she did. Her first steps into Hollywood were not marked by celebration, but by endurance. A single episode. A minor role. Barely a name on the call sheet. Crime Story was not a breakthrough. It was a test. She arrived on set ill, her body weak, her spirit already exhausted from years of uncertainty. Yet she stood under the lights anyway, because saying no was no longer an option she could afford. The set was harsh. Smoke effects filled the air. In a brief moment of chaos, the illusion turned real. She was burned. Not badly enough to stop production. Not seriously enough to warrant sympathy. Just enough to leave marks on her skin. Real scars, forming quietly, mirroring the invisible ones she had carried since childhood. She did not complain. She did not leave. She finished the work. Pain, by then, was familiar territory. Off camera, survival remained brutal. Her apartment was still cold. The cupboards were still empty. And then came the moment she had been dreading, yet secretly preparing for. In her hand, she held her last true possession. Her father's watch. The metal had been worn smooth by time and memory. It was not valuable in price. It was priceless in meaning. At the pawn shop counter, she slid it forward. The clerk barely looked up. As money changed hands, time felt suspended. She did not cry loudly. She did not make a scene. The loss settled deep and silent, like everything else that mattered to her. It felt as though she had lost her father all over again. But hunger does not negotiate with grief. She walked out lighter in pocket, heavier in heart, and somehow still moving forward. Then came Mystic Pizza. A small film. A quiet story set in a windswept coastal town. No one expected it to matter. Yet when Julia appeared on screen, something shifted. There was an intensity beneath her softness. A vulnerability that felt unmanufactured. Critics noticed. Audiences felt it, even if they could not name it. For the first time, Hollywood did not just see a smile. It sensed depth. But it was Steel Magnolias that changed everything. She played a young woman facing illness with grace and defiance, a role that demanded emotional exposure far beyond her years. She was not the obvious choice. On set, doubt followed her. She cried alone in dressing rooms. She questioned whether she belonged among seasoned actors who seemed so assured. Those tears did not weaken her. They fed her. Julia poured every memory of abandonment into that performance. Every quiet night. Every unspoken fear. Every loss she had never processed. On camera, it transformed into something raw and undeniable. The set fell silent during certain scenes, not out of politeness, but awe. Her pain was no longer hidden. It had found form. Recognition followed. A Golden Globe. An Academy Award nomination. Applause that echoed far beyond the soundstage. The industry had spoken. She was no longer invisible. And yet, the emptiness remained. Awards did not fill the spaces left by childhood wounds. Validation did not erase loneliness. If anything, success magnified it. She stood taller now, but the ground beneath her still felt unstable. The world began to open its doors, but inside, the same quiet ache persisted. What had changed was not the pain. It was her relationship to it. She learned that suffering could be transformed. That wounds, when acknowledged, could become fuel. Hollywood had given her its first scars, but also its first proof. That the very things that nearly broke her were the same forces making her unforgettable. She was no longer just surviving. She was burning. And the fire, once lit, would not go out. The story that would change everything nearly never existed. The script was dark. Unromantic. More cautionary tale than fantasy. Then the studio collapsed. Financing vanished. The project drifted toward quiet burial, another unrealized idea in a city built on unfinished dreams. For Julia, it was just one more door about to close. She auditioned again. Not with certainty, but with urgency. Across from her stood Richard Gere, still undecided, weighing risk against instinct. The room was tense, suspended between possibility and doubt. Julia did not argue. She did not perform. She smiled, reached for a piece of paper, and wrote 3 simple words. Please say yes. It was not a demand. It was a plea. Honest. Vulnerable. Unprotected. He read it, looked up, and nodded. In that small, quiet moment, film history tilted. When production finally began, Julia arrived without the armor of stardom. Cheap shoes. Nervous energy. A past still heavy on her shoulders. But once the camera rolled, something undeniable emerged. The smile that had once been mocked in schoolyards now carried warmth, wit, and longing. It did not ask for approval. It invited belief. Audiences around the world accepted. The film exploded beyond expectation. Theaters filled. Lines wrapped around city blocks. Couples laughed, cried, and held hands a little tighter on the walk home. What had been conceived as a risky project transformed into a global phenomenon. Overnight, Julia Roberts was everywhere. Magazine covers. Billboards. Late-night interviews. Her face became shorthand for romance itself. They gave her a name. America's sweetheart. It sounded gentle, affectionate, almost protective. But titles can become cages when they arrive too fast. Fame rushed in before she had time to prepare. The world did not simply admire her. It claimed her. Every gesture was analyzed. Every relationship magnified. Privacy evaporated under constant flashes of light. The smile that once protected her now belonged to millions. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Expectations grew louder. She was expected to be charming at all times, grateful at all moments, flawless in public and generous in love. The persona began to drift from the person. Julia understood something painful but essential. Being adored does not guarantee being known. Her romantic life felt the strain first. Love, once private and hopeful, became spectacle. Headlines replaced conversations. Rumors filled the spaces where trust should live. The very quality that made her beloved, her openness, now left her exposed. She threw herself into work, chasing roles that could outrun the noise. But success multiplied the scrutiny. With every premiere, the gap widened between the fairy tale on screen and the reality of it. She was living proof that magic, when mass-produced, loses its shelter. And yet, something profound had shifted. The girl who once hid her voice now commanded rooms. The child who learned silence to survive now spoke through performance. Her wounds were no longer invisible. They shimmered, refracted through laughter and longing, giving her characters depth that audiences felt but could not articulate. Pretty Woman did not heal her. It revealed her. It showed the world a dream, while reminding Julia of a truth she would spend years learning. That fairy tales, when written honestly, are not about rescue. They are about survival. And sometimes, the happiest ending is simply standing in the light without losing yourself to it. The crown had been placed upon her head. The cost of wearing it had just begun. At the height of her ascent, when her name alone could stop traffic and her smile seemed to guarantee happy endings, Julia stood on the edge of a promise the world was eager to witness. Love had a face, a name, a future mapped in headlines. Kiefer Sutherland was her chosen partner, charismatic and intense, a man whose presence matched the scale of her fame. Together, they looked inevitable. Plans unfolded with cinematic precision. Invitations embossed in gold. Flowers chosen to fill an aisle that had not yet been built. An ivory gown waiting patiently in silence. The press followed every detail as if it were a national event. They called it the wedding of the century. To the outside world, it felt like destiny finally aligning with the fairy tale. But inside Julia, something was unraveling. As fittings continued and congratulations poured in, her voice grew quieter. The mirrors reflected a woman smiling on command, yet her eyes drifted elsewhere, searching for something she could not name. Marriage, for her, was never about spectacle. It was about safety. Belonging. A home that would not disappear without warning. And the closer the day approached, the more fragile that promise felt. Fame had taught her a hard lesson. To be adored by millions does not prepare you to belong to one. Love under constant observation begins to deform. Private doubts become public noise. Intimacy collapses beneath expectation. She felt the old fear return, the one born in childhood. The fear of being trapped in a story that no longer felt true. Whispers began to circle. Rumors of distance. Of betrayal. Of two people drifting apart under the weight of a tension they could not escape. Neither spoke publicly. Silence, once again, became her refuge. But silence also sharpened clarity. Then, just days before the ceremony, Julia made a decision that stunned an entire industry. She walked away. No press conference. No explanation. No dramatic exit. The dress remained unworn. The flowers wilted where they stood. Music meant for vows was never played. What had been celebration turned into shock. Headlines screamed. Speculation erupted. Judgment arrived swiftly and without mercy. Inside an empty room, far from the cameras, Julia sat alone. The ring lay cold on the table. For the first time in weeks, there was no schedule, no expectation, no performance. Just a young woman listening to her own breath, feeling the weight of a choice she knew would define her. Later, She would say that leaving was the hardest thing she had ever done. Not because it ended love, but because it required her to trust herself more than the world's applause. Years afterward, even Kiefer would acknowledge the truth of it. She had been braver than he was. Brave enough to step away from something that no longer felt honest. The scandal marked her. But it did not destroy her. Instead, it carved something deeper into her work. On screen, her performances changed. In Sleeping with the Enemy, fear was no longer imagined. It lived in her body, in the way she flinched, in the silence between words. In Dying Young, tenderness carried an ache that could not be rehearsed. Audiences sensed it immediately. Something darker. Truer. The abandoned wedding became mythology. To the public, it was a failed fairy tale. To Julia, it was a rebirth. Not loud. Not triumphant. Quiet and resolute. She had chosen integrity over illusion, solitude over a life that felt wrong. In walking away, she learned a truth that would follow her forever. Strength is not found in finishing every story. Sometimes it is found in knowing when to stop. Hollywood remembered the scandal. Julia remembered the moment she chose herself. And from that fracture, a new depth emerged. One that would shape every role that followed. By the late 1990s, Julia Roberts no longer chased approval. It chased her. Her presence alone could shape a film's destiny. In My Best Friend's Wedding, she dismantled the idea that a heroine must be perfect to be loved. She was sharp, flawed, calculating, and achingly human. Audiences did not just root for her. They recognized themselves in her contradictions. Then came Notting Hill. A famous woman falling in love with an ordinary man. On the surface, it was romance. Beneath it, confession. The longing for anonymity. The exhaustion of being watched. When she stood in that quiet room and spoke of being just a girl, it was not a line. It was a wound speaking. These films crowned her as the queen of romantic cinema. Her smile became a universal language. Couples measured love against it. Entire generations attached memories to it. To the industry, she was invaluable. To the public, untouchable. To herself, still searching. Then everything shifted. With Erin Brockovich, Julia stripped away the fantasy. No polished glamour. No soft lighting. Just stubbornness, rage, compassion, and a voice that refused to be quiet. She played a single mother fighting power with nothing but persistence and moral clarity. It was not a transformation. It was revelation. The role demanded ferocity. Julia delivered it without apology. The performance was electric, grounded in lived emotion. Audiences did not see a star playing courage. They saw courage itself, messy and relentless. The industry responded with something it had never done before. She became the first woman to earn $20 million for a single role. The number echoed through Hollywood like a challenge. It rewrote contracts. It shifted conversations. It unsettled those who believed power belonged elsewhere. Once, she had been paid less than her male co-star. Now, she set the standard. It was victory, unmistakable and historic. Awards followed. A Golden Globe. An Academy Award. On stage, holding the statue, she smiled through tears and spoke of being a girl from a small town in Georgia. The room erupted. Applause thundered. For a moment, the journey felt complete. But triumph does not guarantee peace. Behind the accolades, exhaustion waited. Power brought responsibility. Expectations grew heavier. She was no longer just performing roles. She was representing possibility. For women. For fairness. For worth. The weight of that symbolism pressed in quietly. She had conquered the system, yet the old questions remained. Who am I without the work? Where do I rest? What does belonging look like when achievement never sleeps? Fame, she realized, is a flame. It warms. It illuminates. And if held too close, it burns. Professionally, she had never been stronger. Personally, the distance between success and serenity was undeniable. Contracts did not quiet the heart. Recognition did not erase loneliness. Power solved problems the world could see, not the ones carried home at night. Still, she endured. She chose projects with intention. She refused to diminish herself to remain palatable. She had learned that strength did not require permission. Julia Roberts was no longer America's sweetheart. She was a force. And yet, beneath the authority, beneath the awards, lived the same truth she had carried since childhood. That fulfillment is not found in conquest alone. That even the most celebrated victories ask a question in return. What are you willing to pay to stand at the top? She stood there anyway. Not because it was easy, but because she had earned the right to choose. After the cancelled wedding and the storm that followed, Julia did not retreat from love. She approached it differently. Quieter. Less theatrical. Her brief marriage to Lyle Lovett arrived like a summer rain. Unexpected. Gentle. Real in its intention. There were no grand declarations, no hunger for spectacle. Just two artists seeking refuge in one another. It did not last long. The marriage ended without accusation, without bitterness. When it was over, Julia did not call it a failure. She called it a lesson. Sometimes love is not meant to endure. Sometimes it exists to teach you what you are still searching for. What followed was not despair, but stillness. Then, on the set of The Mexican, she met someone who did not belong to the world that had consumed her for so long. Daniel Moder stood behind the camera, steady and unassuming. He did not perform for attention. He did not compete with the noise around her. He simply showed up, consistently, quietly. At first, it was friendship. A space without pressure. Without expectation. The world, of course, reacted loudly. He was married. Rumors flared. Judgment followed. Julia said nothing. Silence, once again, became her protection. Time, the only honest witness, did the explaining for her. What grew between them was not dramatic. It was calm. Daniel saw her not as an icon, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had spent a lifetime being watched. With him, she did not have to perform. She could rest. Their wedding took place away from cameras, away from headlines, in the open air of her New Mexico ranch. It was intimate. Simple. Honest. No red carpet. No audience. Just vows spoken softly, meant only for the two people who needed to hear them. After everything she had endured, Julia had finally chosen privacy over proof. Motherhood followed. 3 children entered her life, and with them came a different measure of success. Mornings filled with ordinary rituals. Afternoons shaped by laughter instead of schedules. Evenings where no one asked her to be anything other than present. She would later say that the title she cherished most was not actress, but mother. Yet peace did not erase pain. Loss returned, quietly, as it always does. The death of her half-sister left a hollow that words could not reach. It was not public. It was not dramatic. It was a private grief carried in silence, resurfacing in the still hours of the night. Some absences never soften. They simply become part of the landscape. There was also healing. A long, complicated distance with her brother, Eric Roberts, slowly began to close. Years of misunderstanding and parallel struggles had pushed them apart. Parenthood opened a door that pride could not. Holding her children, something shifted. The past did not disappear, but forgiveness found space to exist. Julia learned that reconciliation does not require erasing history. It requires courage. The courage to meet pain without armor. As the years passed, her career slowed by choice, not by force. She no longer raced to remain visible. She selected roles that resonated, stories that reflected a quieter strength. She guarded her privacy fiercely, understanding at last that peace must be defended. Loneliness did not vanish. It never does. But it changed. It softened. It became less of an enemy and more of a companion, reminding her of where she came from and what she had survived. At 57, Julia Roberts no longer lives to prove anything. Not her talent. Not her worth. Not her resilience. She lives to protect what she has built. A family. A sanctuary. A life measured not by applause, but by calm. Her smile remains. But it has evolved. It no longer hides wounds. It no longer asks for approval. It accepts. And in that acceptance, Julia Roberts found something far rarer than fame. She found a way to stay.